Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. And as more people trickle in, I'll let them join us. Good afternoon, and welcome to Reed's Faculty Office Hour for Spanish and Humanities 110. My name is Maddie Reese. I'm an Assistant Dean of Admission here at Reed. I primarily work with students in the Northwest, and I'm also a Reed alum. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit more about what academics and classes are like here at Reed. Our goal with the Faculty Office Hours series is also to give you all a chance to talk directly to Reed professors, to ask them questions, and to put faces and personalities to the names who may become your professors next year. So with that in mind, I will have some questions to set the scene for our session today, but I also really want you all to ask the questions that you have. So please feel free to drop those in the Zoom chat throughout this call. And if you're shy, you're welcome to send those directly to me via private message as well, and I will present them to our esteemed faculty guest. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Christian Kroll, who is an associate professor of Spanish and Humanities here at Reed, and who has kindly lent us an hour of his day to talk a little bit more about those programs. Christian, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your time at Reed?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Christian Kroll. I'm in the Spanish department and Hum 110 especially. I'm originally from Peru. I lived many years in Guatemala too. And I've been at Reed for 10 years already. 20 years in the US and 10 years at Reed. So I came in, what? Fall 2014. A little more than 10 years, actually. And yeah, so I'm glad to be here and ready to answer any questions you have about Spanish, about Hum 110, or about, I don't know, academics in general, or the city.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which is so beautifully depicted behind me.
yeah,
Um, yes, and so as you might have noticed, Christian is a professor both of Spanish literature, and of Humanities 110, which, to remind you, is the course required of all first year students at Reed, and that's team taught by faculty from lots of different disciplines. So we thought it would be especially valuable to give you all a chance to ask about Humanities 110, since it's something everyone will experience at Reed. But to kick things off, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the Spanish department first, and then transition to talking a little bit more about Humanities 110. So with that in mind, Christian, would you be able to just give us kind of an overview of Spanish at Reed, faculty concentrations, kind of what students could expect from our department?
sure. So we are five faculty in the department. Um, the program is divided, I will say, like in the 100s and 200s, which is essentially language classes. 101, sorry, 111 and 112 is beginner Spanish. If you come to Read with like zero or not close to zero knowledge of Spanish, you start at that level. Then intermediate Spanish, which is the 200 to 11 and to 12. And as the name says, if you have some knowledge of Spanish, perhaps you did 3 years of Spanish in high school or you spend some time abroad, then you can probably start at the 200 level. And the 300s are mostly upper level classes, which are thematically based. And if you're interested in taking Spanish, you can take a placement exam, and the placement exam will tell you in which level you start, like at the 100s, beginners, intermediate, or at the 300s, which is like there's a class called 312, which is kind of a summary of the main grammar points, but it's thematically based. It's discussing one subject chosen by the faculty teaching in that semester, but it's also a review of grammar. So some people place at that 312 is the class at that level. If you have had like a more intense experience of Spanish, or you have been, or you grew with Spanish, surrounded by Spanish, or perhaps you are what we call a heritage speaker, that you spoke Spanish at home, but for instance, never got to write in Spanish, right? So you can talk really well, but perhaps it's more difficult to write. So that's the type of classes that are geared towards also heritage speakers. And then on the upper level classes, which is starts in 321, 321 is like a general introduction to culture and literature, mostly literature in the Spanish speaking world. And it's a class that introduces you to different genres, different movements, and different writers, and different theoretical approaches to the study of literature and culture in general in Latin America. And then you have a variety of courses from which to pick. Two colleagues, one of my colleagues, Ariadna, works mostly in the early modern era, mostly in Spain, which is 1600 to 1800. Also transatlantic studies, which is like the colonialism and the whole colonial trade and transatlantic trade during those two centuries mostly. And my other colleague that also is more focused on Spain, teaches more contemporary stuff. For instance, she will be teaching the fall a class on Lorca, the poet Lorca. She has also taught a class on which is very popular among students, on Don Quixote, or the Quixote de la Mancha, the famous book. And they read the book, but they also read a lot of rewritings of the book and a lot of like, I don't know, interpretations of the Quixote. Then I have another colleague which is mostly focused in film. So she teaches the introduction to film theory in the film studies program and also teaches in Spanish, mostly classes related to film and documentaries. For instance, she will be teaching next year a class called Documentary Resistance, which is how resistance is portrayed in documentaries on Latin America and Spain, right? Social movements, human rights issues, issues of violence, issues of mostly that type of documentaries, right? So, and so those are three of my colleagues. My other colleague, Diego Alonso, he works mostly in Southern South America, that is Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. He does mostly literature and also related the role of images also in literature. And myself, I mostly focus like most of the readings, cultural readings I choose are usually from Central America and Mexico, but I also include depending on the class I'm teaching from other parts of the Spanish speaking world, right? So I teach classes that I will call them like thematically based. They're not, I will say, literature classes. They're a mix of both theory and literature, in the sense that reading literature as theory and reading theory as a literary text too. For instance, classes I've given in the past is like Space and Power, which is a study of the relation between space, like urban space, border space, and relations of power and domination. So urban theory, political theory, critical theory, and how space is represented in Latin American films and literature, for instance, right? So it's a dialogue between cultural materials and more theoretical materials. It could be anthropological, political inclined. It could be depending on the class, right? For instance, right now I'm teaching a class that it's called Latin American Critical Theory, Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Critical Theory, which is how Latin Americans have thought of themselves, right? So starting like mostly 20th century, but a little bit of the 19th century, but how Latin Americans have conceived of themselves, issues of nationality, issues of surrender, issues of race, issues of the relation between like Latin America and the US, etc. And a class I like to teach too, and will be teaching in the fall, is called Decentering the Human, which is a critique of anthropocentrism. So it's mostly focused on different perspectives, theoretical perspectives that go beyond humanism, what is called posthumanism, critical posthumanism sometimes. So we go from animal studies to disability studies to indigeneity, indigenous studies, to ways in which I don't know, the effects and the relevance of climate change and how that comes from a certain understanding of what it means to be human and a critique of that, and also how that is represented through literature and how can we use literature and films to understand those processes, right? So it's kind of a mix. And speaking more broadly, you can major in Spanish, you can also minor in Spanish. The requirements change a little bit depending on where you start, but I will say like the minor is three, usually it's three upper level courses, and then the courses you need to get to the 300. So if you start at the 200 level, then it's the 200 plus another three. If you start at the beginners level, then it will be beginners and intermediate four plus another three, right? So more or less it's between like 4 and 7, depending on where you start for the minor. And the major is, of course, more classes, and it's more geared towards a broader perspective of Latin America and Spain, right? But it's not only focused on literature, it's mostly there are like cultural studies too, issues of political, how politics relates with aesthetics, how film relates with issues of violence. So it's very interdisciplinary in that sense. Right. So that's a big overview. And of course, there are many options to study abroad. There are options to study abroad knowing Spanish. For instance, in Merida, you have to have a certain level of Spanish, and you go there, you take classes in the program with which we partner, but also in the local public university, right? So those are in Spanish, so you have to have a certain level of Spanish. Usually intermediate level is enough. There's another similar program in Argentina, and I think there's a few also in Spain, Madrid, Barcelona. And there are some programs too that are geared towards people who don't necessarily speak Spanish and they can take classes in English there, for instance, in Monterrey, in Mexico, in Barcelona, in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. You are required to take Spanish while you are there, but it's one class and the rest are whatever you want to take related to your major. So there's two ways of going abroad to a Spanish speaking country, right? And of course, the thesis and all that, but that's for everybody. So that's a kind of an overview. I don't know if you have any questions, specific questions about the program, or I don't know, anything you want to know more about.
That was excellent. Thank you for the overview, Christian. I'm curious what you see in terms of the students taking Spanish classes at Reed. Are they primarily Spanish majors, Spanish minors? What's kind of the mix of students you get in your classes?
I will say it's a huge mix. Majors, there are few. Minors, there are many. And there are people who just take classes because they want to, right? So, but I will say like the variety is diverse in the sense of majors. For instance, in this class I was telling you about, like that I'm teaching right now, I have anthropology majors, I have political science major, I have computer science majors. In the center in the human, I usually have like biology majors. Also, so students from different majors and even like students in their second years. Sometimes first year they don't take first year students don't tend to take upper level classes in the languages, but some of them do. So it's a variety and that's a mix. And I think that's helps the class because given that it's at least the ones I teach and most of my colleagues teach are very interdisciplinary. So for instance, somebody majoring in anthropology probably has a lot to say one day, and another student majoring in political science will say more another day. So it helps everybody, right, to have a variety of backgrounds there. So yeah, it's diverse in that sense. Yeah.
Definitely, and totally true across the board at Reed, but I think especially in some of our language classes, a great
Mhm.
diversity of perspectives. Yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention is that we also some of the classes in the Spanish department and in other languages too are cross-listed as literature classes, which means that you can take them for literature credit without knowing Spanish. Like that doesn't count for a Spanish class, but it counts credit for like literature for group one requirements. And in those cases, usually the discussion is in English, but the material you read is in English or Spanish, depending for what you're taking it, right? So that's another option to be exposed to, I don't know, um, social processes, history, literature, culture from the Spanish-speaking world, but not necessarily knowing Spanish, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a great opportunity as well. Great. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the community surrounding language learning on campus? This will probably be the last question I have that's Spanish specific. So, students, if you have any Spanish related questions, please get them in the chat sooner rather than later. But outside of the classroom, what is the community like around language learning in Spanish in particular at Reed?
Yeah, something that I haven't seen it in another college. Maybe the college I taught before it had one language dorm. That's it. But at Reed we have like five or six language dorms which are dedicated to people who are interested in different languages. So each language that is taught at Reed, Spanish, French, German, Chinese, and Russian. So there's a dorm. Some are bigger than others. Like the Spanish house is bigger than the German house, but there is for every language, there's a house in which the idea is that you live in that house surrounded by people who are interested in the language and the culture, some of whom might be native speakers, especially in the Spanish house. And the idea is you conduct your daily life using the language in as much as possible, right? And there are plenty of activities in the houses to do, which are organized by something that I've never heard other colleges having, what we call language scholars, which is uh, usually literature or related fields students, but from Argentina or Barcelona usually, who are in their, I would say like mid 20s to, yeah, mid 20s more or less, who come to read and are part of those houses and part of the Spanish program or the German or the French program. And they also meet with students doing different types of activities related to each class. For instance, if you're taking intermediate Spanish, you have 3 times a day, 3 times a week, you meet with your like Spanish professor, a faculty from the Spanish department. And then there's an extra hour with that language scholar that comes from Argentina, which is just about like talking about exploring other topics, doing other type of communication. And they bring whatever they are interested in. And of course, their culture from like the one from Argentina right now comes from northern Argentina. It's not from Buenos Aires. So you also have that exposure. And there's plenty of like activities, I would say cultural activities from each house organizes. And also there's for instance a translation symposium, which is a divisional thing among the languages, which is open to students. You just translate from a non-English language to English if you're a native speaker from a different language, or if you are studying, I don't know, Russian or Spanish, you pick something, you translate it. It has to be like a minute and a half. And 70, 80 students, faculty meet in this lecture hall, and you just share what you translated. And there's a little booklet printed about that. And that type of activities too. And yeah, there are other more like geared, like more organized for instance, the teen diversity too, that are geared toward different cultures. But yeah,
Great
and
stuff.
related to Spanish, there is an increasing, I will say, like Hispanic population at rates of students that has been growing in the last 10 years. I've seen it grow. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Campus is more diverse than it ever has been, which is excellent. Um, I'm glad you brought up the language houses and the language scholars, since that's a big part of being a language learner at Reed. We did have one question come in about the mix of native and non-native speakers in the department. So among the faculty, is it mostly native speakers of Spanish? And then what do you see in students who take the classes as well?
Like for instance, Spanish, we're five, four are native speakers of Spanish, and my other colleague, like you couldn't tell that she's not, right? So she spent like 20 years living in Spain, for instance, right? So it's almost near native. And in the other houses, in the other languages, departments, it's more or less the same correlation. Like for instance, French, I think it's four, three are native speakers. In Russian, it's three, two are native speakers. So yeah, most, I will say like 80% of the faculty teaching like culture, language, literature are native speakers, right? Perhaps even more. And another thing that it's not common is that it's faculty teaching the language classes. It's not like lecturers who are hired temporarily. It's the same faculty that teaches upper level classes or Hume teaches the language classes. So that's also something that it's not very common, I will say, in other colleges, right?
Definitely. That is actually one of the other questions I wanted to ask you about is what do you think are some of the biggest differences studying Spanish at Reed compared to a different kind of college?
I think what I mentioned, like
Yeah,
you are getting like the one teaching the class is a faculty that teaches also upper level classes. It's not like a part-time lecturer or something like that. Also, because you have direct access to also research that the faculty is doing and sometimes incorporated in language classes, right? So if you take, I would say, intermediate Spanish with me, you most likely end up reading short stories from Central America, right? If you end up taking it with one of my colleagues, it might be Argentina, right? So that also has an impact in the classroom. And I will say like the Spanish, like in general, the language houses also play a role in making the community more, I would say like more active in that sense, like more, yeah, more fluid in that sense because, and the houses, the language houses are, most of them are together. So it's kind of and weirdly, it's like on a different part of campus actually. They're together, but they are separate from the other dorms, right? So you end up having like a community of language learners there, right? So, and what else can I think of different from other? That exposures to language scholars too is different, I would say. And and I would say like the content of the classes per se is it includes more real cultural material than I've ever seen in other classes or colleges I've taught before. That like in the intermediate level, you are like reading a novel, for instance, right? And in the even first year, you are already exposed to like small pieces of journalism, even sh really short stories. So it's much more focused on the culture of the countries too, right? So of the Spanish speaking world. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we're not big on textbooks here.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, that's been a really helpful overview. One thing I did want to ask about before we move on to Hum 110 is about research, since you touched on that briefly. And one of the opportunities that we talk about a lot in terms of the undergraduate experience at Reed is access to doing research with faculty members. So if you could just give us a little more information about that and maybe about the research that you see students doing as thesis students, for example, that would be great.
Mhm. Yeah, mostly I will say research in the languages in general, I will say in the language departments in the humanities in general is more like one-on-one. It's not a lab usually, right? So it depends on the project the faculty has and the type of research the faculty member is doing. But it entails sometimes, like I have a colleague of mine in the language departments, a student helped her contacting native speakers of that language here in Portland and conducting like brief interviews to see how like the original French, for instance, or Russian, I don't remember, I think it was Russian, how it changes morphologically the language itself as an immigrant here, right? So other type, once I, for instance, had a student once who helped me just building a database of articles for a specific project for an article I was writing. So that type of research also exists. I collaborated with two students writing an article that we ended up never submitting because we were two-thirds done when the pandemic hit and we just couldn't do it. But we were there, we were trying, right? So writing together also happens, and one-on-one, like doing archival research, just finding resources, finding articles, finding material, and I think, yeah, creating databases for instance, I think my colleague who teaches film also, she was writing a book. I needed like I would say like scene by scene description of a film, right? So that's research because that ended up being in the book, right? So students who took classes with her, like film theory, some of them were like doing that research, right? Yeah. So that type of things does happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Really cool stuff. All right. Well, thank you all for listening into this overview of Spanish at Reed. I think we're ready now to transition to talking a bit more about Humanities 110, which is again, yep.
Just one question in the chat before we completely move. Oh yeah. So yeah, if you're interested in taking Spanish, you have to take a placement exam,
Mm.
and that placement exam assesses the different ways in which you can perform in the language, like hearing, listening, writing, and depending on that, assigns you to either first semester beginners, second semester beginners, first semester intermediate, second semester intermediate, or the upper levels. So it depends on that, right? And it tends to be very accurate. Sometimes you end up in a class that you know it's too much for you or too little, or you know more, and then you talk with the faculty and you're moved to a different class. But it's a very good assessment of your level of Spanish and it places you in the right place. Yeah.
And on a practical note, for incoming students, those tests become available in the latter half of the summer. I'd say around the start of August is when you'll be able to take those classes online, so that you'll be able to sign up for the appropriate language class at registration.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, thank you for catching that, Christian. So now we'd like to talk a little bit more about Humanities 110. Yes.
My other side of the brain, yeah.
Yeah, enough of that Spanish. No, we can keep talking about Spanish, of course, but um, I would love if you could give our students here a little bit of an introduction to what Humanities 110 is and what your role is as a professor teaching in that course.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Humanities 110 is I will say the only really mandatory class at Reed that you have to take as a first year student. It is the class, the writing intensive class that any higher institution has to have. The way they do it, it's different, but every college, every university has to have a writing intensive class for first year students, right? Sometimes it's individual seminars, sometimes I don't know, they do it in different ways. But I think Reed way of doing that is very unique. It's a one syllabus for everybody. So you will all be reading the same stuff at more or less the same time, watching the lectures at the same time, and discussing the material at the same time. And all first year students, let's say, I don't know how many there are, they are divided in groups of 17, more or less, 16, 17, sometimes 18, but it's usually around 17. So usually we have like, I don't know, 23, 24 sections, and you meet with your, what we call conference leader, 3 times a week if you are taking it for 1 hour, or 2 times a week for an hour and a half, and you discuss the material that is on the syllabus, right? So the idea of the class is not so much the content of each reading, but I will say, is mostly focused on the um, skill base in a sense, right? So for instance, improving your critical thinking skills, right? Learning how to do close readings of text or improving what you already know. Um, how you present arguments in a written form and in a oral form, right? Because all those conferences are just a discussion among mostly students, right? The faculty, that's why it's called conference leader, sometimes guides the discussion, might have some questions, but it's usually the students who are in charge of the conversation, right? And one of the, I don't know, nice things about it is that you know that everybody who started with you is reading the same stuff, right? So that creates a lot of community. Students like meet in dorms to watch the lectures for the next day. So the way it works is the syllabus is set for 3 days a week. So, and each day, almost each day, there are some days in which you don't have a reading or lecture, but each day there's a reading assigned and a lecture you have to watch. The lecture exposes you to different disciplines. The idea is that almost always none of the faculty is a specialist of the lecture the faculty is giving, right? So for instance, I gave a lecture on the Parthenon, right? I'm not a classicist or anything. So I do a lot of research to present an analysis of the Parthenon that it's not like what you will hear like in a conference for like what's a specialist of the Parthenon, right? Which wouldn't be helpful. So it's more or less how you can read texts from different perspectives. So we have people from history, from philosophy, from political science, from the languages, from art, uh, giving lectures on using methodologies from their own fields to analyze different texts. Some do it context-based, some provide backgrounds, some do close analyses. So you're exposed to different ways in which you can interact and engage with a text. And by text, I don't mean a written text necessarily. It might be architecture, it might be sculpture, it might be images, it might be reliefs, it might be film in the spring. So you're exposed to different media and different disciplines and different type of text. The content is in the fall, at least for now, in the fall is focused on the ancient Mediterranean, that is ancient Babylonia, ancient Greece, Egypt, what will become the Israelites, Persia. So, but it's mostly focused, it's not an analysis of each culture, it's mostly focused on cultural interaction. So, how cultures interact with each other, how difference is created among cultures, how the idea of the same and the other is created among culture, between cultures, and also explores like general themes like how is power justified, what is the relation between politics and aesthetics, right? So different things. And you explore different themes, and it's organized, I think, 2 3 week unit more or less, but it's focused on the ancient Mediterranean. And in the spring, the first half of the spring, so ancient Mediterranean is multiple cultures through, I would say, like 4,000 years, right? So you have a lot of time and a lot of space, and how that interaction happens, and and yeah, how cultures essentially develop in relation with each other sometimes, right? Most of the time. And then in the spring, you have 2 models. The first one is Mexico City, and it starts from the Mexica, what is commonly known as the Aztecs, um, the invasion by Spain and conquest, colonialism, independence, and the creation of the new modern state of Mexico. So you have one place through 500 years, right? And how different cultures interact, how different perspectives interact with each other to create, in this case, a sense of Mexico as a national identity in one case. How, for instance, relations of race, ethnicity work in colonial Mexico and modern Mexico, that's completely different as the way race is conceptualized in the US, for instance, right? So you get that perspective. Also, you get, for instance, there's a lecture on Mexica philosophy. So that's usually we have very lively discussions about that. And what else? So yeah, you go taking a look at different cultural pieces from Mexico, films in the 20th century, novels in the 20th century, but also, I don't know, like theater from the 17th century, right? And what it's called the codices, which is like essentially, um, I would say like pictograms by Mexica artists, written, some of them done during colonialism, a few of them done before colonialism. So you are also exposed to different genres and different materials and different ways in which culture is, I don't know, like recorded and transmitted. And the second part of the spring is mostly focused on what it's called the Harlem Renaissance. So it's one city, like Harlem in New York, 10 years, 20 years, right? So it's very, and it starts with Reconstruction and different perspective of at the beginning of the 20th century, different perspective on what it meant to be Black in America at that moment, and how Black culture relates to white culture, and different ways in which Black artists, philosophers, intellectuals, sociologists envision um, Black citizenship and Black participation and Black incorporation into society, the different aspects, right? From Du Bois to Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, different ways in which Alan Locke, so different perspective on Black culture, and how all that led in the 1920s to an explosion, what it's called the Harlem Renaissance, an explosion of essentially Black art, right? So we take a look at art, we take a look at novels. For instance, we are currently reading Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. We will be reading Invisible Men by Ralph Ellison next week. We also read poetry, um, essays related to the Harlem Renaissance. So you have different, the fall is a lot of time and a lot of space, one place through time, and one like very concise, specific spot and related to one cultural interaction, right? And across the year, we explore different like themes: race, ethnicity, gender, uh, power, aesthetics, the role of art, right? So, and that's what happens in the classroom, the readings you do, and the writing is throughout the year. You write 7 papers, about like 4 or 5 pages each. And for each paper, you meet for about like 20 minutes, half an hour with your conference leader, a faculty, to discuss your writing. So you have 7 meetings throughout the year, just one-on-one with your conference leader, the faculty teaching the class, in which you talk about your writing. right? So that's very unique. That I've never heard of that anywhere else, right? And it's I really like teaching human 10 because you really get to know students. You stay with your same conference the whole year, so you really get to know the people around you. And maybe the first month you are not that comfortable, but after spending like 2, 3 months with the same people, like you are definitely comfortable sharing your thoughts and opinions on most material. And yeah, and you, me as a faculty at least, I get to know students like really well during that year, like because the interaction is 3 times a day, 3 times a day, 3 times a week, plus the paper meetings and any office hours that well students choose to use, right? So that's I think I cover everything. Maybe maybe I'm forgetting something, but yeah.
No, I think you covered it all. I'm curious what your approach is, and if you can speak to how other faculty approach it too, to the paper conference. What's the goal as you talk to students about their writing in that first year?
Uh, this is something I say usually the first day of classes that I don't have a, I'm not expecting anything. So I know that students come from different backgrounds, have had different opportunities. So some of you might be excellent writers, some of you might not be able to formulate a thesis, not because you can, but because you didn't have the chance, you didn't have the opportunity. So what I do is usually use the first paper to assess where your writing is and take it from there. So some of you might need help with formulating a thesis, right? As a first step. Then we focus on that. And then once you've been able to do that, we can focus on the structure of the paper and then focus on writing a nice intro, right? Maybe you come from a different background and you had a lot of exposure to literary analysis. You can write a thesis, then we can focus on diction, on the use of words, and how the syntax is working, how you are presenting the arguments, do they work together? So I will say it's not like it's I will say my at least I do it like very tailored to each student. And for me, it's like as I tell them, like I don't there's no standard you have to reach, right? The idea of Hume is becoming better in what you do. Like if you start here, hopefully you end up here, but if you start here, you will end up here, right? That's the idea. Like I don't have a standard that you have to like check, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. I often frame Hume 110 as students on ramp to read to get them accustomed to the conference style of learning, to working with professors closely, to the writing skills they'll need. Um,
And
but
also to the
yeah,
fact that you don't get a grade. Like you don't
yeah,
get
can you
grades for your
explain
paper.
that?
Like you don't get grades for your papers, you get comments and a lot of comments. Some of them are written, some of them are orally when we meet, but you don't get a grade on your paper, right? So we try to de-emphasize grades, and that's something I really like. You do have a grade at the end of the semester, and you can know your grade if you choose to, but they will not be shared with you automatically, right? So I've had a student, most of the students I've had like found out their grades when they actually had to apply to grad school, like in fourth year. And that leads to a different approach to the classroom itself. And you see other classmates as actually partaking in the same process. It's not competition anymore. It becomes something else, right? It becomes working, really working together. And you can definitely notice that. Like never ex I've never had a student coming to my office saying, "Oh no, I don't deserve a B, I deserve an A." Never, right? I have friends who work in other places who, yeah, deal with that all the time, right? But I don't think it's the spirit here. The spirit is just enjoying the process of learning, of knowing how to share ideas, of exposing yourself to different ways of thinking. And yeah, you will get a grade, but that's not as important. Grades don't tell much actually. So so yeah, so but you will get comments. So you will get a paper with like in my case, for instance, in my case, I write bullet points and then we discuss in conference. But other colleagues write like a page of comments. I do that for one specific paper, for instance. So I try to do it in different ways. But yeah,
Great. Can you also, speaking of comment, talk a little bit about 4 week and 8 week comment?
sure. Yeah. So since you are not getting grades on almost anything, right? For instance, there are some things in which there's not a grade, but you can calculate. For instance, like Spanish exams, right? In which you have to answer and you can know like if you actually add the points, you know your grade, right? But in most cases is you don't know. It's just comments. Even on labs, I've heard from advisees, right? You don't get a grade. You get comments on your lab report. And so the idea of the fourth grade and the eighth grade comments is precisely to help you, I don't know that you are doing well or not well, right? So if you're not doing well, which means I think it's a C or less, you will get a comment in the fourth, mostly in the eighth week, I think, right? You will definitely get a comment. Uh, I think we're changing now that everybody gets a comment, even if you're doing great. So you will know. But it used to be that we focus on students who were not doing that well, so they knew and they get a chance to improve their grade. And but that's the idea, right? It's kind of like it's not a you don't get a grade, but you will get like some comments. Oh, you're doing great. Keep working as you have been working. Or like attendance could be better. Or I don't know, like the labs, like you are missing a couple of labs. Pay more attention to the labs or use office hours, right? Things that the idea is to help students. I'll say mostly the 8 week comments. The 4 week comments, I think is I will say like it's been helpful for specific cases in which you notice a student that it's like really falling behind and you know it by the fourth week. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes it does. So that's a good moment to intervene. And in most cases, fourth week is too soon, I would say, but you still will know that you are doing well, right? So, yeah.
And how are those comments delivered to students?
Oh, those comments are delivered via email. You get an email with the comments and you access those comments on a web page. I don't know where students access it, but faculty access it on Iris. And I get, for instance, currently have five or six advicees, and I get those comments from my advicees classes. So I write comments for those students taking my classes, and I receive comments about my advices from the classes they are taking. So I usually, as an advisor, check if everything is going well. I write to everybody, but those that are going well, they see the comments. I say, okay, I've read the comments. It seems everything is going well, but please let me know if you want to meet and discuss, right? Those that are not doing that well say, come, right? We need to talk. So it depends. The approach varies too. But and the students get the comments. I get the comments from my advisees, and the students get the comments from the professors they're taking the classes with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important to know that your academic advisor will get to see these comments as well, which means if there is anything you need to talk to anyone about or you need support, someone's already looped in and knows about it as soon as the comments come out as well. Great. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. If you students in the audience have any questions about Humanities 110, this is a great time to drop them here. Or these could be questions about Read in general, the
Or
thesis process, Spanish, yeah, or
Mhm.
anything, really. We'll do our best. Um,
So the first one here, I have how conference groups form. Oh, they are formed by students themselves. Like for the registration, there's the list of conferences. So what most advisors advise students to do first year is pick any other classes and then see which conferences work with your schedule because you will have one that works. And there's like usually 23, 24 options at different time of the day. Some are 3 times a week, some are 2 times a week, and you just register for the conference that is more convenient. Sometimes I've heard of people who knew each other before college and choose the same conference because they want to be together in class. But most of the time, you just randomly end up with people, right? So yeah, but you choose which conference, usually depending on the schedule you have for the other classes. But sometimes I've heard people who have heard that this faculty is really good. I want to, it depends, right? Totally. Yeah.
Good question. Have you received any other questions?
No, I think that's the only one I see here. Yeah.
Okay. So as a Hume conference leader, you work with
Mhm.
first year students for whom this might be the first time they've been expected to speak a lot in class. And I'm curious uh,
Mhm.
how you see students adjust to that, adjusting to the grading, adjusting to the conference style, and how you support them with that transition.
For most students, most of the time, it takes a couple of weeks, right? Because, like high school is increasingly being a place in which you are just getting information, right? But you are not like, you don't usually talk that much in most, at least from what I've heard from other students coming from high school. So it's kind of a shock sometimes in which you are expected to talk. And actually, you are the one who have to choose what to talk about. Right. In my conferences, for instance, we're reading, I don't know, Genesis, Exodus, or their eyes were watching God. So I do have some questions, but I usually say, well, okay, is there something you want to talk about? And I will say like 90% of the time it goes, right? And I don't use the questions I have. So students not only participate, but actually lead the conversation, right? So it takes some time of adjustment sometimes for some students more than for others. And those first 2 weeks, I'm just, in my case at least, sensing who is who, right? And sometimes there are students who it's not like they don't want to participate, they just can't, right? For any reason. So, or they need more time, or there's a lot of anxiety involved. So I try to work with those students that like participating in class discussion is not the only way to participate in class. There are other ways. For instance, right now I have students that the student has participated more in the spring than in the fall, but still it's difficult for the student to do that. So the student sends me questions they are interested in. So, and I share them with the class without telling who wrote the questions, of course, right? That's one way. And other way in which students participate when they don't talk that much is writing little comments about like the readings, right? So usually it's the student that comes up with an option. I usually give students, you can do this, 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 and the student chooses which one, right? And in some specific cases in which I know that it's mostly a matter of waiting, I wait. I would say. And it usually works. Like by the fourth, fifth week, students start to share more and talk more in class. So it's a process. Right. For some students takes more than for others, and it's totally fine. Yeah.
Great.
Does the faculty teaching Humanities 110 change year to year?
Mhm.
Oh, yes, but I would say there's a core group that I will say like we have two lists. One list is current faculty teaching in the course. Right now it's 23, and everybody who has taught in the course, which is 45, I think. So some departments rotate who is teaching. For instance, in the Spanish department, we are committed to two faculty teaching Hum 110 each year, but it's three of us teaching Hum. So one year it's me and my colleague, usually 2 or 3 years in a row, and then somebody comes in and somebody goes out, right? So, but you will get, it's mostly the same group of faculty teaching Hum most of the time. Like some people might rotate in and out of the course in specific year, depends also on sabbaticals or if the department needs extra hands because they had more students that they thought they were going to have and cannot participate in him that end. And for instance, that colleague will not be, but it will be covered by some other department, right? So yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Mhm.
Is there any particular piece of advice you have for incoming students at Reed as they think about Humanities 110 and adapting to a new environment? And you can think about it for a minute.
No, this is if you end up coming, you will hear if I don't know, but if I usually for the last 2 years I've given the first lecture on Hume the first day.
Hmm.
So something I say there, and you will hear it. So sorry if you hear it again. It's that college are the 4 years in which you're totally entitled to not know anything and doubt whatever you want to doubt about yourself, about everything. So it's the 4 years you have to actually not be responsible for knowledge. I mean, in the sense of having to know something. It's the opposite, right? You are sharing knowledge, you are collaborating with others. So you are completely entitled to doubt, to yeah, to doubt who you are, to find out who you are, and explore different aspects of you as a person, of you in your interest, of you in your social life. So yeah. I think that's be open to whatever it comes. And yeah,
That's great. Yeah. Be open to not knowing the answer. Yeah. All right. Well, we have just a few minutes left. I have a couple more fun questions for Christian, but if you in the audience have any other questions, this is
I
kind of
have a
your last
question here
chance to get them in. Yeah, go ahead and take that one.
message that says, is the number of faculty representing each department proportional to the department's size? Um, Kind of, I will say. Like for instance, we in Spanish are five and we collaborate with two. In the French and German, it's three or four. They collaborate one each. In English is a bigger department and part of the like job description in the English department for many of my colleagues is teaching Hume. So they rotate, but it's like six, seven teaching Hume. There is usually like one or two in philosophy, and philosophy is a five-person department. There is usually like two or three from history, and history is also like a six, seven-person department. So yes, it's more or less proportional, but I wouldn't say that it's like totally proportional. It depends on the year too. Right?
That
Yeah.
makes sense. Nice. So, one of my fun questions for you is what's different about teaching at Reed versus other places you've been, studied, or taught?
This will sound maybe funny, but it's I always in my upper level classes, right? I always and in Hume too, I tell them that for me the best class is the class in which I don't have to speak. And I can only tell that to students here at Reed because I can rely on the fact that they most of the time did the reading and are really willing to discuss it, right? And I also tell them like it's impossible to do all readings all the time, right? So yes, sometimes you won't be able to do the reading, but in my case, I rather have you come to the discussion and tell me I didn't do the reading this day for this day than miss the conference because you didn't read. Because you also get a lot from just hearing other people discuss, even if you didn't do the reading. Of course, if not doing the reading becomes like systematic or often enough, then we have a problem, right? But once in a while, like, yeah, it's going to happen. So, yeah, the best class for me is the one in which I don't talk. But that has a lot behind that, right? Because it's not going to happen the first classes, right? But you create an atmosphere in which it's possible, and that can only happen at Reed. I haven't seen any other place in which I can say that and know that it's going to be true at some point, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Awesome.
Yeah.
And my last fun question, which maybe you already answered it, is what do you most love about teaching at Reed or about Reed students?
What I just said.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah.
level of discussions in the class and the interest like most students have in actually discussing, like really honestly being open to discuss ideas and discuss texts and discuss ways of thinking, being, living, and explore who they are through, in my case, it's through the classes they teach, but of course they do it in different ways in different parts of the college. And yeah, and being, I don't know, that level of depth sometimes in the conversations is very unique, right? And somebody asked directly if we read Invisible Man. Yes, we do. That's the last thing we read in Human. So that will be the reading for the last 2 days, the last 2 weeks. Actually.
Mhm. Yes, some of you may already have a copy, but for those
Yes, you
who
probably got it.
haven't yet
All right.
applied, I don't want to
Yeah.
spoil too much, but yes, a good preview of
And
what's.
I usually advise students to read The Invisible Man during the winter break because it's a long novel. So if you read it in December, January, that yeah, it helps. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like watching the end of a movie before you
Okay.
hit play on the start of it.
Sorry, that was my dog. Yeah.
Yeah.
My dog getting happy because my daughter came back from school. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, we are just about at time, and I want to be respectful of what else other people might have going on. So I think I'll go ahead and wrap things up and say thank you so much, Christian, for
Sure.
lending us your time and for these wonderful details you've shared about humanities and Spanish at Reed. And if you have any closing remarks or want to advertise how students can learn more, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I just want to say that please feel free to write me an email. Just tell me, oh, I was in your Zoom meeting. I have these questions. You can easily find my email and just put my name, Christian Kroll, read, and you will find it. So please, totally, it's chkroll@read.edu. So feel free to write me if you have any further questions or want to know more about Hume Spanish or any other subject. If I can help you, I will. And yeah, and we didn't get to talk about Portland, but it's a really nice place to be. I really enjoy being here. So yeah.
Yes, Portland's a wonderful, wonderful place to be. Reed is so excited for all of you who are joining us in the fall. And we hope that you'll keep in touch. Please keep an eye on the Reed Admission virtual events page for more exciting events like this, where you get to talk directly with professors and college leaders. And if you do have any questions, that's a really generous offer from Christian to take your questions. So don't take that for granted, but also feel free to reach out to us at admission@reed.edu, and we're happy to get you answers to all the questions that you have. All right, folks, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate
Bye.
you. Yeah. Yeah, and have a good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.